So I wanted to be sure we had time to talk about your more, I guess, for lack of a better word, like pop-oriented output of music. And so, along with your husband, Nikki Adams, you formed "GADADU," which you all describe as encompassing. And I'm going to quote this because there's no way I can like get this right on my own. It encompasses a kaleidoscopic sense of time and texture, weaving odd meter grooves, synth spiked orchestral arrangements, and unorthodox song forms into a dreamy, soulful sound. So I think it's fair to say, just based on that, that this is a project that's deeply informed by your work as a composer, and you can speak more to that, I'm sure. But also, it's like not contemporary concert music. Like you listen to it, and it's it's like a song. It's not a
Yeah,
piece, right?
yeah.
So can you share more about Gotta Do? I mean, what role does this cross genre songwriting project have in your overall body of work as a composer?
Definitely. I actually, well, first of all, it took forever to come up with that description. It's really
Yeah.
challenging to try to have a band that doesn't fall squarely into any genre. And this one does not. But I was thinking it's actually kind of the opposite. Like for me, the question is how has Gotta Do influenced my composing of concert music?
Mm,
Because
yeah.
I started doing them around the same time, and Gotta Do and my concert music composing were happening simultaneously. So, in one way, I felt like a need to keep them separate. And they also, of course, cross pollinated. And I think I felt a need to keep them separate because my classical education and like composition studies and some of my teachers made me feel like I had to keep my songwriting stuff very separate and segregated almost from my concert music composition. And I've tried to do that, and I mean, ultimately I realized it was better just to let these things, intermingle and, speak to each other, which I couldn't stop that from happening anyhow. But Gotta Do is yeah, it's a project for both me and my husband Nikki to write songs, because we both like to write songs, and we were already doing it before we met. And then not long after we met, we started like collaborating and showing each other song sketches, and that turned into this band, Gotta Do. And then, a year after, we were a duo for about a year, and then we started playing with some other musicians, including Patrick Adams, who's a trumpet player, also Nikki's brother. So now my brother in law. And originally we were playing with a drummer named Moses Eder, who now lives in New Orleans. He's a great player. And then Dan Stein on bass, upright bass at first, and then electric bass later on. Yeah, that was the instrumentation originally. And then when Moses, our first drummer, moved away from New York City, we started playing with Arthur Vint, who's a really great drummer, who now lives in Arizona. So there's been a lot of changeover. He was our drummer for many years up until the pandemic, when during that time he moved back to Arizona, where he's from originally. And we also started playing with a tenor sax player named Ayumi Ishido, and she's really great. Also has everyone in this band also has their own band, or at some point during this band had their own band. And so, it was always kind of crazy putting together rehearsals and gigs, but also a lot of fun. Just like for me as a classical musician, I learned a ton by playing with all of these people who are mostly coming from a jazz background.
Mm.
And my husband is more a jazz musician more than he is a classical musician. And so I've learned a lot from him and his approach to songwriting. But basically, we each write songs kind of on our own, and then come together and work out some of the details and the arrangements. And yeah, with the band, I really I worked a lot on conciseness, I guess, kind of fitting a lot of musical ideas into a short, easily digestible container of a song, and also kind of learned how to leave things open to musicians and performers, especially musicians who can improvise, to try to make space for them to kind of let their voice be heard through the song. in a way that's, more influenced by jazz. And, you know, over the years, I've listened to tons and tons of different jazz musicians and live, and also, recordings of the more legendary ones. And I just love that style and that whole tradition. And this band is kind of my small foray touching on jazz, but definitely I don't consider myself an expert by any means. Just a huge fan, and someone who's always learning.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So you said that you started this and composing at the same time, pretty much, and you were kind of discouraged by, I guess, teachers and like people you were studying with, discouraged to mix them together. Was that like a viola teacher or composition teacher?
It was
Uh,
one of my composition teachers, who, yeah, like I had, it's a whole saga, but yeah, I was kind of drawing ideas from songs that I was writing and going between writing them for wanting to compose chamber pieces based on song sketches from the band.
yeah.
And it was tricky because my songs were not always like, they definitely weren't like standard pop songs in a pop song formation. And there were a lot of elements that worked well, that would have worked well for chamber composition. But at the same time, I guess looking back on it, I kind of understand that advice from my composition teacher, even though back then I didn't, I was frustrated by by that. But I kind of looking back on it, I understand the need to kind of be sensitive to the instruments you're working with when thinking, coming up with musical ideas. And I guess this depends on what kind of composer you are and what kind of music you write. Depends pretty seriously on those things. But yeah, there were a couple of pieces that I composed that were based off of songs. And now looking back on them, I'm like, well, maybe I could have thought more about the, you know, instruments that I was writing for, and maybe this song wasn't the best fit for these instruments at that time. I don't know. Yeah, it's tricky. But then at the same time, I did a lot of orchestrational things with my arrangements in the band, and kind of got really crazy with layering and experimenting with like different kinds of vocal harmonies and like string textures, and blending tenor, sax, and trumpet with strings in unusual ways. So there's definitely a lot of cross pollination.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting when, and maybe with what I'm about to say, people might think I am being like negative interesting about this, but I just like kind of it's neutrally interesting to me, like the relationship of concert composers to more popular styles, because I remember when I got into grad school, I'd played like in bands and stuff, and a lot of times speaking with composers on this podcast, even, I mean, a lot of people get that's like their initial foray into composition is like hanging out in a band with their friends and writing songs. And so certainly I was no stranger to that, and I loved and continue to love all kinds of different musics. But I remember going into my first jury, and my jury in grad school as a composer, and the teachers gave us like all the stuff to prepare for, and it's like, be prepared to do like, show us that that things about like instrument ranges on the piano, and score identification, like all the basic stuff. And then one of the things was like, come prepared to like play a pop song. And like I like freaked out because it's like, I don't know, like I'm not a singer, I can barely play piano. And I went in and I think I played some song by Beirut. I was really into that band at the time. And it was
Nice.
just like the same chord progression over and over again. And one of my teachers was like, what do you like about this song? It's like so basic. And I was like, well, like there's like all these different instruments. Like it's hard. And they're like, oh, you're into timbre. And it's like, oh, I'm into timbre. Yes, you're right. And then like everything I've done since then is like very timbre oriented. But I go off on that sidetrack to say that I think it's a huge bummer when, I don't know, classical musicians think that like they can't learn anything from more popular music. And that was like a little eye-opening experience to me, that it's like, oh, I can actually enjoy the things I enjoy and actually cherry pick and learn from
Hmm.
them, and come up with ways to like enhance my music through all the music that I listen to, really.
Yeah, totally. I share that sentiment. Like, I really think there's so much that we can learn as, people in the classical world, which is now kind of more broadly defined, I think, or has way more tangentially related musics. But yeah, just listening to other styles of music, not writing off pop music or more popular musicians, even though they might not be very popular, even if,
Right,
you
right.
know, but just other styles are so helpful to, yeah, just for timbre, for rhythm, for especially rhythm. I feel like we often get so bogged down in other elements of music that we forget about rhythm and all of the amazing things that can be expressed and communicated through it. Yeah.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Micromaker by Loose Leaf Transmissions. We hope you enjoyed this brief glimpse into the inner workings of the creative life. If this resonated with you, be sure to check out the full conversation on Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast exploring craft and process, philosophy and inspiration, and the honest, often messy parts of being an artist, creative uncertainty, purpose and identity, and resilience. You can find Music Maker wherever you get your podcasts or by visiting musicmakerpodcast.com.